Hello, and welcome back to the world of Wysteria. Tonight, I will be reading chapter 36. And this will be presented in 3 parts. All right. Wysteria, chapter 36. Sitting on his back porch the next morning, Will began thinking about his conversation with Jeremy. In that world, his dream world, where anything, no matter how fantastical, was possible, it was easy to accept everything Jeremy had told him. Other dimensions, goddesses, guardian angels, immortal men, all of it seemed perfectly logical. But now, here at home, in the waking world, the real world, he couldn't help wondering if these things were merely abstractions, metaphors, poetic interpretations of purely natural forces that gave rise to reality. No matter how much will or energy one could summon, it was difficult to imagine that a flesh and blood human in this world could telekinetically fling cast iron kettles or summon lightning bolts, spring 30 feet into the air, or turn their body to stone, making it impervious to blows, blades, or bullets. Jeremy had explained that such miracles were unlikely here, given the nature of this collective creation we call our universe. But were they even possible outside the sphere of the purely theoretical? Since his life there in Wysteria with Emily had become his dominant reality, did it matter? Jumping to another world, he thought, standing once again on the upper terrace of his garden, now bathed in bright sunshine. How surreal. He'd been to Jeremy's realm before, but the circumstances were much different. He'd been pushed from his world, thrown into the void with no warning, no chance to reflect on what was happening. Now, he would have to detach himself voluntarily from Wysteria. He was in no great hurry to begin traveling off-world, but Emily clearly was. He assumed she would be early tonight, anxious to get started, but he waited for nearly an hour before she finally showed up. After an enthusiastic greeting, Emily explained her tardiness, saying that she'd had trouble getting to sleep, not out of worry, though. Just excited, she told him. And then I began thinking about traveling with you to other worlds and all the places I'd like to show you. I started making a mental list. I know, I'm getting ahead of myself, but... Soon, said Will. We'll see what happens today. But before we make the attempt to Jeremy's place, I'd like to try another quick trip, just to warm up. That's probably a good idea, Emily replied. Where to? How about the other side of the ravine, he suggested. Over there, she asked, pointing to an area directly across from them. Maybe a little farther down, he said. A place we can see, but where neither of us has ever been. Yes, we can do that, she said. My aim may be a little off, though. Can I help steer, he asked, or doesn't it work that way? Emily told him he could try, and that it might help. She explained that he needed to focus his attention on their target while still staying attached to her. And if we get separated somehow, she said, then we meet back here. After readying themselves, they relinquished their bodies, crossing into and passing through the world between worlds. A moment later, they rematerialized on the opposite side of the river valley, several hundred yards west of the location he had briefly explored. "Is this where you had in mind?" Emily asked. "Yes," he said, looking around him. "So, did you notice any difference during the trip?" "Actually, yes," she replied. "You felt a little lighter. In fact, there was a moment when it seemed you were almost pulling me." Though, again, Will had needed Emily's help to get into the emptiness. He did have the distinct feeling that he was behind the wheel at one point in the journey. "It's a beautiful view of the castle and falls from here," she remarked. "You can see the whole picture." After admiring the sight for himself, Will turned and stared into the forest. "I still wonder what's in there," he murmured, thinking out loud. "We can go see," she said. "Do you want to take a quick walk?" Will considered it for a moment, then answered, "No, not now." Once they began exploring, it could well turn into an all-day activity. "Maybe if we can't make it to Jeremy's world." "We'll make it," she said with assurance. "Are you ready?" "Is there anything I should know, anything I should do differently?" he asked. "Not really. The process is the same," she told him. "Just stay with me. I know the way." "Can I help? Should I try to focus on his world, or would that interfere?" "You've only been there once before," said Emily. "Would you be able to form a clear enough picture?" "Maybe," he said. "I do remember the way it smelled." "That seems to be a strong cue for you," she noted. "Why don't you concentrate on that? I don't think it could hurt." She gave Will a kiss for good luck, then clasped his hand firmly. "If you start feeling any strong turbulence during the trip, it might be that your image is conflicting with mine. If it's bumpier than what you felt before, just let your mind go blank and focus on our connection." "I understand," he said. Emily had explained that the first step, moving into the darkness, was the same, whether tunneling within Wysteria or jumping to a foreign world. Now, however, he knew they were embarking on a journey that would take him far from home. And as Emily began to tug, he could feel his body resisting their departure. Reminding himself there was nothing to fear, he relaxed and fixed his attention on the scent he associated with Jeremy and his world. The discomfort he was beginning to feel ceased, and the blackness enveloped him. Then came that curious sensation of directionless motion, and within moments, he and Emily were standing in Jeremy's world, staring at the strange, desolate landscape. "Told you," she said. "Yes, you did," Will replied, still slightly disoriented. "How was it?" she asked. "Any different?" "Not really. A little hesitation at first." "I felt it too," she said. "But here we are." Then Will noticed a distortion in the space a few yards in front of them, from which the figure of Jeremy quickly took shape. "Well, well," said their host. Guests. Emily started to speak, then paused and looked up at the sunless sky. Good day, she greeted him, unable to determine the time. It is, Jeremy responded. I suppose congratulations are in order. He then looked each of them in the eye and smiled. You did well, he said, nodding his head approvingly. And since you are here, there is something I would like to show you. Come. With Will and Emily flanking him, Jeremy began walking across the nearly featureless plain. Will looked into the distance ahead of them and saw nothing really, no landmark that they seemed to be heading toward. After traveling in silence for nearly 10 minutes, Will was about to ask where they were going, thinking it might be prudent to remind Jeremy that their time, unlike his, was limited, when Emily spoke up. Will told me about Lily, she said. That's pretty wild. Yes, Jeremy replied, his eyes fixed forward. I didn't think that sort of thing was possible, she remarked. What sort of thing is that, he asked. I didn't think anything created in ordinary dreams could become real. Certainly not characters, she said. Everything is real, my dear, he replied, in its own way. Yes, said Emily, but Lily is a conscious being, isn't she? She became an independent life. Everything is conscious in its own way. And life, anything subject to time, is alive, he said. Again, adding the qualification, in its own way. And death? Will queried. Death is the moment time stops? Jeremy chuckled. No, Will. Quite the opposite. Will thought about his puzzling response for several minutes as they continued walking toward whatever it was that Jeremy wanted to show them. I don't understand, he said finally. Time doesn't stop when we die. Death is the moment of absolute stillness, Jeremy replied. If he'd meant this as a clue, it did Will no good. But if death is complete stillness, then, for one who is dead, wouldn't time simply cease to be? They walked another 50 yards before Jeremy answered, saying simply, one might think so. How far is it, this place you're taking us to? Emily asked him, politely, but clearly growing impatient. How far? Jeremy suddenly stopped, turned, and looked behind them. Perhaps 20 miles, he said, his eyes pointing to a small, dark mound on the horizon. We're going there, she asked, after exchanging confused glances with Will. Yes, he stated. Don't worry. I'm aware that you two don't have all day. I just wanted to walk part of the way there. But we've been walking that way, the opposite way, she said. Why? Why not? Jeremy responded. As Jeremy stared at the distant hill, Emily looked at Will, her mouth open. Will merely shrugged. Shall we? Said Jeremy. now offering each of them a hand. "Are we going to fly again?" she asked. "No, not today," he answered. "Since Will can travel, we'll take the more direct route." On the face of it, their roundabout itinerary seemed bizarre. But if Jeremy's plan had been to walk for a while, before ultimately tunneling to their destination, then in fact it didn't matter whether their walk took them closer or farther away. They joined hands with Jeremy, who instructed them to do nothing but clear their minds and hold on to him. Will scarcely had time to close his eyes when he felt a sudden, powerful pull, and then darkness, infinitely empty, infinitely full. And that concludes part 1, and we'll be back with part 2 of the chapter in just a moment.